Hi, welcome to Lecture 2. We're going to continue our discussion this week with the subjects of fieldwork, research methods, and research ethics. So we started last week in talking about some of the sort of big concepts behind cultural anthropology. This week we're moving more into sort of the nuts and bolts, the practice of doing it. So what, in other words, cultural anthropologists actually spend their time doing, and how you move from having an idea of something you want to learn about to actually going out and collecting information in the world so that you can write up the kinds of things that allow you to talk to other people about your findings. Okay, so we're really in this section focusing on research practices. So I'm going to lead you through a few different topics related to this issue of how anthropologists do their work. The first topic I want to touch on is that of field work. And you've been reading in the stuff that I assigned for you to read for this week already about this, so I'm going to assume that you're at least kind of familiar with it. But fieldwork is the term that anthropologists use to talk about our approach to collecting information. Okay, so fieldwork encompasses a bunch of different specific methods that we're going to talk about. But the overall idea with fieldwork for cultural anthropologists is that, and this is different than the kind of research conducted by other social scientists, for example. Fieldwork entails actually locating yourself in the community where you want to learn about people's lives, okay? So unlike other social sciences, where, for example, you might engage with people in a lab or something like that, right? You might invite people into your own space. Contrary to that, anthropologists go to the social space they want to learn about. So most anthropologists spend many months, if not many years, living in the communities where they want to do their study, okay? This is often referred to as the ethnographic method. Doing an ethnographic study means embedding yourself, essentially, in a social world that you want to learn about, and attempting to learn about that world in a really holistic way, meaning from multiple perspectives, by directly engaging with it. Your book pointed out that anthropologists think about what are sometimes called both emic and eidic perspectives. That's a little bit older language. We don't hear that as much anymore, but it's an important concept, so let's stick with it for the sake of thinking about the concept. So the concept with emic and eidic perspectives is that the emic perspective is the sort of insider viewpoint, meaning how people who grow up in a social world think about stuff themselves, right? It's the perspective from being a part of a particular cultural world. The eidic perspective, then, is sort of the perspective of a newcomer, somebody looking at that cultural world sort of from the outside. So anthropologists try to engage both of those perspectives. That is, trying to understand how people living in that cultural context think about themselves and about their world, but also thinking more broadly and comparatively across human societies. Okay. The term holism, I put that there because it's very important to the kind of research that anthropologists do. Holism means thinking about any phenomenon from multiple perspectives in a sort of rounded way. Ethnographic fieldwork is holistic in the sense of, again, having sort of multiple facets. One looks at their subject from multiple viewpoints, and also the way that anthropologists write up their findings is holistic. That is, it touches on many different sort of components of what the anthropologist learned with the hopes of giving the reader a sort of 360 view of what it is like to live in that space. Okay. Now, sorry, I'm sucking on a cough drop so I don't start coughing in the middle of the video, which I do sometimes, so I'm not just eating while I talk to you. I thought we might just talk a little bit about what some of the both advantages and challenges are of doing fieldwork in this way, right? I think there's a lot of advantages. Again, unlike other kinds of research practices, anthropologists really spend a lot of time becoming deeply familiar with the social phenomena that they're interested in. Because anthropologists spend time actually living in the place they want to learn about, they therefore are able to get a glimpse of sort of the informal sides of people's day-to-day lives. If you think about it, for example, if you do a formal interview with someone, you're going to have a certain kind of exchange for that hour or two. Anthropologists do that, but they also just sort of hang around, right? So they're there on the off hours when you're not having a direct conversation, just to sort of get a feel for a place. Now, there are also lots of challenges. One of the most obvious ones, I think, is that doing this kind of embedded field work, it's fairly labor intensive in the sense that anthropologists spend, again, months, often years, collecting information that allows them to write something, right? So it's something that has kind of a long arc in terms of the timeline from beginning to end. So it's not something that's always very nimble. Anthropologists invest a lot, and they often learn some sort of deep truths in that way. But it also means that anthropological projects are somewhat slow to come to fruition in comparison to other kinds of fields. So those are things to keep in mind. Again, as you continue to read all semester, you'll be reading examples of the work anthropologists have done that is based on this kind of field work. I had you read one account of fieldwork experience by Lee because I thought it was sort of a nice introduction to not only all the exciting things you can learn by doing anthropological fieldwork, but also some of those challenges, right, of trying to live in a world that you are a relative newcomer to. So, for example, you read Lee's account of trying to sort of show off by presenting this great gift of the Christmas ox to the people he's been living among. And as you read, basically becomes the laughing stock of that community, right, is made fun of. And is, in a lot of ways, just brought down to size, right? It's pretty clear that he was acting a bit arrogant, was taking for granted some of the relationships he had with people in that community. So they let him know through various kinds of teasing that his behavior was not actually in keeping with how people are usually expected to behave. So the reason I think it's a good example of what fieldwork is like is that even if you have been living in a field site for a long time, as Lee had by the time this thing was written, he'd been living there for a couple of years. There's still such a sort of vast amount to know that when you're in a place that you did not yourself grow up, there's often all kinds of challenges and subtleties that one can miss. Luckily, the people you are living with will probably clue you in, although it might be a little bit embarrassing for you at times, if not very embarrassing. Most anthropologists have stories of embarrassing stuff that they accidentally did because they didn't quite understand something about what appropriate behavior was supposed to look like. Okay, so that's just a sort of really quick introduction to field work. Now, fieldwork, as I say, is sort of the general category for the time that anthropologists spend living in a community they want to learn about. Within that category of fieldwork, there are lots of specific techniques that anthropologists use to collect information while they are living there, okay? We refer to those different techniques as methods, all right? And I'm going to break that down even further. And the other key topic we need to talk about is that anytime anyone, anthropologists or others, do research, there's all kinds of ethical considerations that come up. So when we talk about methods, that is, what kinds of data collection techniques a researcher, in this case an anthropologist, is going to use, we also need to talk about what the ethical issues are that attach to those methods, and how we can do our best to do research in an ethical way. So when anthropologists do field work, they're drawing on multiple different research methods that they use in combination with one another, and they therefore also often have to deal with multiple different ethical issues. So let's talk about those methods. Cultural anthropology is a social science, and the vast majority of the work that cultural anthropologists do is qualitative in nature. Your readings for this week touch briefly on that issue of qualitative versus quantitative approaches. And while there are some anthropologists that use quantitative methods, that is, those that involve, as the name suggests, quantifying information, right? In other words, counting it, and typically subjecting it to a statistical analysis. There are some that use those methods. However, the vast majority of anthropologists and the vast majority of methods used by anthropologists are qualitative, meaning it's not about counting stuff, counting instances of things. It's about interpreting the information that you collect. And that information often comes in a narrative form, right? It's things like stories people tell you during interviews, okay? So things that are not readily counted. But if you hear stories from lots and lots of people, you can start to interpret some of the themes and some of the key points that emerged from those narratives. So these techniques, these methods then that I'm talking about, are by and large going to be used in a qualitative way, okay? So what are those methods? I've put together a list. This is not an exhaustive list, but a list of some of the most important ones. Observation is a key technique that anthropologists use. Sometimes that takes the form of what I'd call just observation, and sometimes it takes the form of what I'm calling here participant observation. And the distinction between the two is sort of what the name implies. Participant observation means observing something while also doing it, right? Being a part of it. Observation can also be done in a bit more of a detached way, where you're, say, sitting off on the sidelines and watching people do stuff. In participant observation, you would get up and do that thing with them, and also try to attend to what's happening such that you can record information about that experience. Interviews are another key research method, and interviews as a category are really just talking to people and collecting information through those conversations. So interviews can take a few different forms. There are more informal kinds of conversations that can count as interviews, right? And there are also more formal versions where you actually want to sit down with someone and talk to them about very specific issues. So we'll talk more about interviews a little bit later in this lecture, but various kinds of questioning of people and recording their answers is what we would put in that category of interviews. Surveys, the third method on my list here, is not dissimilar from interviews in that it also entails posing questions to people and recording their answers. But it takes a somewhat different form. Typically, surveys are more structured in the sense that they take the form of a written document that people either fill in themselves or someone poses the question and fills in their answers for them. But the point of a survey is to reach a much broader range of people and to maintain a greater sort of consistency in how the questioning is done. Okay, usually by means of a questionnaire, right? You probably filled some out yourself, received them in the mail, right? Often, consumer research surveys, questionnaires go out in the mail. So surveys are another kind of technique that anthropologists will sometimes use. Document analysis can include a lot of different things. I added this here particularly to note that lots of anthropologists are also interested in examining the historical context for whatever cultural phenomenon they're studying about. And a lot of times that will mean visiting historical archives or local government offices to look at documents that reflect various historical events in a particular area. So anthropologists will often look at that. Mapping is another technique, depending on the topic, of course, but being able to document the sort of physical layout of either a community or a region or even the plan for a house often can be very useful. Genealogies are used to chart out family relationships. Often family relationships are the basis for the society that you're working in, right? How people are related to one another, how power and wealth are passed among generations in a family. All of these are really important and central issues. So figuring out who is related to whom and how is often very important, and anthropologists spend time charting out families through genealogy. And finally, I just wanted to note on here photography and film. There are anthropologists who focus much more on those sort of visual elements of anthropology and, in fact, do things like make ethnographic films. But even anthropologists who primarily produce written work, right, articles or books, will often use photography and film just as a method, right, as a way of collecting information. You can capture a lot more information, especially when there's something sort of richly visual going on, by taking one photograph and trying to write down every single thing you see. So often anthropologists will use a combination of techniques to capture the visuals and also things like writing down notes. We've talked a little bit about qualitative and quantitative approaches already, right? And as I've said, most of cultural anthropology is qualitative, and these methods that I mentioned mostly fall into that category as well. The final thing I wanted to mention about this question of sort of orientation and research, which again was also alluded to in the thing you read for this week, is the difference between science, social science, and humanities. And again, although the broader field of anthropology, which we talked about in Lecture 1, includes some elements that fall very much into science, right, like biological anthropology, cultural anthropology is a social science, so it's really not using the scientific method. And indeed, it's a social science that tends to overlap in lots of ways with humanities fields, meaning humanities fields like history, right? And even other kinds of nonfiction writing. So anthropologists are at that sort of qualitative humanities end of the social sciences in terms of where we're located in that broader scheme. So I wanted to touch then a little bit on another of the things that you read for this week that I think both gives us an example of some of those research methods I've been describing in practice, right? Somebody using them. And also can be sort of a segue into talking a bit more about research ethics. And that's the Stirk article that you read. Stirk, of course, is a European anthropologist who conducted research about prostitution in American cities. Particularly, she worked in New York City and in Atlanta. And as you read, she utilized exactly some of those research methods that we've just been discussing. Certainly those of observation and interviewing. And you really get a sense, I think, from her article of what the ethnographic approach is like, in the sense of it being important to spend time with people during the day-to-day of their lives, during the sort of mundane activities of life. Stirk talks in particular about, because of the subject that she was working on, the importance of spending time around people to develop rapport. That's another really key part of doing anthropological fieldwork. You can't just randomly walk up to strangers and say, hey, I want to live here, and ask you a million questions. Or you can, but it may not go over very well, right? One needs to both introduce oneself and, as in any relationship, any friendship, it takes a bit of time to get to know someone, to get to trust someone. So because Stork was working with people who are doing something for a living that can get them into legal jeopardy, right? Something that is illegal. She had to very slowly earn trust of the women she wanted to interview. And that process of developing rapport meant engaging with the women's lives in various ways, right? Likewise, because of Stork's subject, there were lots of ethical challenges. As I said earlier, every research practice has ethical considerations attached to it. Something like Stork's project probably has more because of the fact that she has to be very careful about not, frankly, getting the people who are her informants in trouble, right, with the police. And also because there's certain risks of violence, right, to herself and to others. So she had to work very carefully to make sure that she was safeguarding the well-being of the people who were generous enough to work with her, and herself. Putting herself in danger would also be an ethical problem. So, again, this is a broader issue, but it's one that's just sort of highlighted by the nature of Stork's project. So let's talk then a little bit more about ethics in anthropological research. One place to start is looking at the ethics code of the major American anthropology professional organization. It's called the AAA, the American Anthropological Association. So like other professional organizations, it's sort of a clearinghouse for information and sort of policy making for all the people in that profession, for anthropologists. And the AAA has a statement on ethics that includes the major sort of ethical considerations that anthropologists as researchers are encouraged to take very seriously. So I thought we could just talk a little bit about these. And these are also touched on in your reading, okay? They're fairly straightforward in the sense that I don't think there's anything that we wouldn't expect. But I think the fact of having an ethics code like this in this professional organization underlines both the importance of ethics, but also the sort of challenge of taking something that is somewhat subjective and somewhat abstract and turning it into a code, right? So indeed, the fact that there's an ethics code is not the end of the conversation. It's really the beginning of the conversation, right? Because the fact is you have to make a lot of judgments and make a lot of decisions in your own work about whether you are indeed meeting the expectations for ethical research. So the first one is do no harm. And again, reflecting just on the example from Stork's research that we were just talking about, it's important for any anthropologist to understand what the risks are for anyone who might become involved in their project, and make sure that those risks are minimized as much as possible, and that they do not lead to harm on anyone's part, right? So it's, in other words, of course, not doing any direct harm, but making sure that you don't inadvertently or indirectly cause harm to other people. To be open and honest regarding your work. Unlike some other sort of investigating that we may see on TV or wherever else, anthropologists do not do undercover work, right? We've all seen those nighttime news shows where they, put a hidden camera on someone and then they, collect footage and information about something without people knowing that they're being filmed or investigated. That may have a place in certain areas. Anthropologists consider that to be an unethical approach to research. So one would never just show up in a community and just start asking questions or present themselves as being someone that they are not. The anthropologist announces themselves and what their intentions are from the beginning, so that people can make a good decision about whether indeed they want to be a part of a study, okay? Which leads to the third point on this ethics code, which is to obtain informed consent. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the notion of informed consent, Any research typically will require that participants grant informed consent before anything proceeds. Medical procedures always have informed consent. You've probably had to sign an informed consent at some point in your life. Informed consent is just what it sounds like. So it suggests that first, people need to be informed. They need to understand basically what they're participating in. So they need to know what kind of a study you're doing, why you're doing it, how much time it's going to take from them, what you're going to do with the results, etc., etc. They need to be informed. And then, having received that information, they need to explicitly say, yes, I agree to participate, right? So anthropologists will sometimes use an actual informed consent form that people sign. Lots of anthropologists work in contexts where people are non-literate, so you cannot necessarily give somebody a sheet of paper and say, here, read this and sign it. So there's other ways to make sure that you orally tell people about the study and obtain their consent in an oral way, right? So there's a few methods to do it, but the point is to make sure that people know what's going on and they have the opportunity to agree or to say, no, I don't want to be interviewed by you, right? So that's what informed consent is about. Weighing competing ethical obligations. This one, again, speaks to the messiness of research ethics. The fact is, there will be varying people that one will engage with during field work who may have, different desires in terms of involvement in a study. And there's a difference between, people in a community and the government officials that are, some of the people involved in that community. So figuring out how to balance all of the sort of ethical obligations to various parties in a field space is, again, one of the challenges, but one of the expectations for anthropologists. Number 5 is make your results accessible. This is also important for even after doing the research, when you've actually written something up and are going to publish it. Making sure that people in the community where you worked are able to see those papers or to hear about those results. Protecting and preserving records. This goes again to issues of confidentiality. Part of informed consent is making sure that people's well-being is safeguarded in terms of their information and things they say not being released to other people if they do not want them to be. Okay? So guarding your records, in other words, that may say who said what, right, is extremely important. Even fairly mundane interviews, if a political situation changes 5 years later, what people said in an interview could suddenly be a liability for them. So maintaining that confidentiality is extremely important. And finally, maintaining respectful and ethical professional relationships. As an anthropologist, one, again, deals with not only community members who you may be living with or learning from, but also other academics, other researchers, other anthropologists, and people in other fields in the area of your fieldwork and around the world. So being basically a good colleague is also extremely important, and it's a part of being an ethical practitioner. Okay, so I wanted to get a little bit more into sort of the nitty-gritty of how you all are going to apply this information that I've given you about research methods to methods paper. And for that paper, you're going to be engaging in 2 of the methods I've just described, observation and interviewing, okay? We've already talked a little bit about these, so let me give you a little bit more information. Observation, as I said, can either be conducted as a sort of detached bystander or as a participant in an activity. If you want to think about that for a second and sort of the pros and cons of whether observing or participant observing is the best way to go, think of it this way. If you were trying to learn about a particular sport, right, let's say football, right, American football, For observation, imagine that you are sitting in the stands watching a football game. And think about, from that position up in the stands, if you didn't know anything about the game, from that position sitting up in the stands, what could you learn about football, right? Now, think about the same project. You're trying to learn about American football. Now imagine that you're on the field, all suited up. You're a player on one of the teams, right? What could you learn from that vantage point about the game? And you can already start to imagine, right? If you're sitting up in the stands, you get a different sort of, almost like a bird's eye view of the strategies involved in the game. If you're down on the field, you'll get much more of a sense of the sort of physical exertion that it requires. You'd get to hear the sort of conversation among players down on the field, right? So those are the two forms of observation we're talking about. Both are important. If you were doing a bigger project, you'd probably do some of each, right? But that's sort of, in a nutshell, the difference between observation and participant observation. Both kinds of observation, the main way that one is going to record what you do as an observer is through field notes. That's typically what we call them, field notes, which just means that while you are doing your observing, you're going to make a point of jotting down, right? If you're, depending on where you are and what you have access to, either literally scribbling stuff down in a notebook or typing stuff into your phone or into a laptop or whatever, right? Keeping a sort of running, a running set of notes about what you're seeing, right? Seeing and observing. That's the main product that comes out of the observation process. You can, as I suggested before, also do stuff like take some photos or take some videos. But neither of those, and those are a great addition, but neither of those is a substitute for notes. So you should plan on for the observing you're going to be doing for this assignment to be doing some note-taking. Those notes are going to be really important. It's especially important, I'd say, to take notes in real time, too. We all think we're going to remember a lot after we do something and then go write it down. But if you've ever had the experience of taking notes in the moment versus taking notes even an hour later, you'll know that a lot is lost, right? Little things that you would never have remembered, you will capture if you do it in the moment. So good note-taking in the moment is crucial. The other method, interviewing, again, we've already talked about a little bit, can take a few different forms. The kind of interviewing I'm going to be asking you to do for this paper is unstructured interviews, okay? So I want your interviews to be formal in the sense that I want you to write interview questions in advance, and I want you to sort of formally ask a particular person to do an interview with you, and I want you to record the answers. So I want it to be formal in that sense, like purposeful. But I want it to be unstructured, by which I mean it's okay if you have a set of questions you plan to ask, and because of whatever the person answers, you come up with a new question on the spot, right? So that's what we mean by unstructured. It doesn't mean it's a free-for-all, but it means that you're going to follow the lead of the person you're interviewing. They say something interesting, you might want to pivot in that moment and ask a follow-up question, right? Excuse me, cough drop again. So you're going to do interviews of an unstructured nature. And again, I'm going to talk a sec about what you might ask people about. I put on here a couple of other examples of kinds of interviews that anthropologists do. Life histories and genealogies, we've mentioned that a little bit already. So, in other words, what you ask people about in an interview doesn't need to be some, like, huge monumental thing. Just asking people questions about their own lives and what they've done, what they've experienced, what they do on a day-to-day basis, all that is super important stuff for an anthropologist, okay? So it doesn't need to be about something that was out of the ordinary or, you know, something that was really, you know, a special moment in time. It can be, but it can also be interviewing people just about how they live their lives, okay? Okay. So, you know, sort of to cap off the end of, since we're talking about research practices, to cap off the sort of end of that arc, what anthropologists ultimately do is to write up all the things they learn through that set of research practices. And that final result is called an ethnography. So, for example, you guys are going to read a book in this class called Labor and Legality, which is an ethnography. It's the sort of the research product. It's what the once the anthropologist sort of collects all that information and processes it and analyzes it and puts it all together into the form of a piece of writing, that's called an ethnography. And I want to point out a couple of really important characteristics of ethnographic writing. One is multivocality. What that means is ethnography or ethnographic writing often attempts to provide space for multiple voices, okay? So in other words, it's not a piece of writing that's just from the viewpoint of the anthropologist. It's not just the anthropologist's voice. It does include the anthropologist's voice, but the best ethnographic writing also includes the voices of lots of other people from the field site, right? This is one of the reasons, as you'll see, as you continue reading for this course, that a lot of anthropological writing includes lots of direct quotes from interviewees, from people in the field, right? So that you hear the voices of people other than the anthropologist. It's not this one perspective. It's a piece of writing that attempts to sort of bring together and bring into conversation with one another multiple perspectives, multiple voices, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing is the notion of reflexivity. Ethnographic writing is also often reflexive. And what that means is that because of the way that cultural anthropology research is done, because the anthropologist goes into the field, basically the anthropologist is sort of part of the social world that they are studying. So one of the things that anthropologists have decided because of that is that it's important for anthropologists to essentially reflect on their own presence in what we write, right? So in other words, you wouldn't just pretend like you were an invisible observer, right? And say, oh, people did this, people did that. Instead, you'd say, well, I walked into the room as an anthropologist, and people said, hey, who's that? And then I had these conversations where I learned X, Y, and Z, right? The idea with reflexivity is that it's important to essentially be transparent, be honest about the anthropologist's presence and role in what they learn, okay? So this means that you will often see in the stuff that you read that you learn something about who the anthropologist is, right? And how the anthropologist was perceived by people in that field site. The way the anthropologist related to the people he or she was working with, right? And all of that, again, is not an accident, and it's not just a quirk of the writing style. It's considered an important part of the nature of the research experience and research practice for this discipline, okay? And I want you to keep those two things in mind, multivocality and reflexivity, as you do your own projects for this class, okay? Because I think those are going to be really important tools for you to use in writing up your own experiences, doing some of this research activity and reflecting on what happened and what you learned, okay? Okay.